Hey there, welcome to episode 84 of the Cafe Genius Impresario's audio program. I am your host, Dan Hugo. Today we are recording at about 8:08 a.m., a little after 8 in the morning on Friday, October 4, 2024. Today's topic has been an interest of mine for quite some time. It is a topic that is almost certainly confusing. I know it has been when I've brought it up with city folk, government types. Dumb city. That is not meant to be pejorative in any way. It is a commentary on the opposite of a smart city, which is what we'll be talking about today, which seems apropos given the disaster that has befallen some states on the southeast part of the United States. Hurricane and tropical storm Helene, but this is generally interesting, I think, and should be a general consideration. These types of disasters are only reminders, not the least of which we should be reminded of is that these will happen again. Hopefully, wherever you found this audio program, you have encountered the episode description, which will include some show notes. I have a summary, which I will read to you, and I have several referential links. A lot of them go to FEMA, which is not a bad thing, I promise. Cafe Genius was conceived as a project to attempt to elevate the entrepreneurial innovative community or ecosystem. The entrepreneurial innovative ecosystem, people often use the word community, they misuse it, in the greater Vegas area, but beyond as well. The greater Vegas area is home to many people who are passing through. It is a great place for remote work. So occasionally people will participate in the greater Vegas entrepreneurial innovation ecosystem from parts unknown. And hey, wherever you are, there may be a disaster in your future, perhaps. So it's always ready to be ready. It's always ready. It's always nice to be ready. It's always a good idea to be ready. And so we're not talking about in great detail today the notion of preparing. This is not a prepping program. But it is some things to think about. And again, it's a topic I've been interested in to some degree for quite some time. So let's get started. Smart cities are supposed to be a thing in these modern times. The what makes a smart city may be up for some debate. At the very least, people plus infrastructure is the makings of a smart city. So what happens when the infrastructure, which people often grow to need and depend upon, goes away? The links for today's episode are several. The first two, as usual, my own. By the way, in this program, I produce 4 programs a week. Only in 3 of them do I include the self-promotion links. And in this one, I've left it in the word host because occasionally we used to have guests when people would be interested in talking about such things. That may return. So when you see host by Dana Coffee, that is to differentiate if we ever have any guests on again and they want to have some links, we'll have specific links to their resources, home pages, company pages, and so on. Just a little background. So my own shameless self-promotion, buymeacoffee.com/DanHugo and Ko-fi.com. That's ko-fi.com/DanHugo. You can visit each or either of these sites. You are under no obligation to spend any money, but I do use them as a point of contact. You can get the links to all of my audio programs. I just mentioned I produce 4 each week, 4 different programs each week. There are some GitHub links. I have links to my favorite coffees in case you're curious, because any funding that does arrive through either of these channels, Buy Me a Coffee or Ko-fi.com, does go towards coffee, which powers all of my projects and many other things. So don't forget buymeacoffee.com/DanHugo, Ko-fi.com, ko-fi.com/DanHugo. These are often used by open source projects as well for people who want to donate to those efforts. I am developing some open source projects as part of my civic volunteerism efforts at the Innovate for Vegas Foundation, of which I am the managing director. It's a 501c3 public charity. I'll leave that with you and you can ponder. I have some hurricane and tropical storm Helene links for FEMA. So I'm not going to read the links just because they are numbers in 4 cases. There's a Hurricane Helene resource page at usa.gov. That's a federal government resource. So usa.gov/hurricane-Helene, Helene. If you are listening to this podcast, by the way, and you are in one of the disaster areas, I'm glad you have the time and access to the internet to do so. But I hope you're making other use of your time. But if this is in some way helpful, well, that's great. Thanks for giving me your time. For everyone else, though, access to these resources is something you would want to do ahead of time if you happen to be in one of the affected areas. And how do you know if you are going to be in an affected area? Well, sometimes you don't. I don't say that lightly. Hurricane Helene in South Carolina, in Florida, so the SC and FL links, and then Tropical Storm Helene, and these are FEMA labels. So the storm was downgraded to a tropical storm. It's listed in their disaster index as a tropical storm. That's what they do. Tropical Storm Helene in North Carolina and Virginia. So there are links. That's FEMA.gov/disaster/ and then a number. And those numbers are 4829, 4828, 4827, 4831 in the order that I read them. So that might be useful as I read them, but generally speaking, if you go to FEMA.gov, FEMA.gov, that's the Federal Emergency Management Administration, you will be able to navigate to, there's a top level page for the current, it's under current, so I don't know if that will be current a year from now, but there is a current disaster area starting point that will lead you to these pages as well. I didn't include it because the current in the URL tells me that it may move, and I don't know how they handle that. So for the moment, FEMA.gov is a good place to start. These, by the way, these pages, if you visit them, it's difficult for people in situ to visit these pages, right? You're not necessarily thinking, where am I going to get potable water and access to electricity? Oh, and by the way, can I access the FEMA website? These are often they're tertiary or lower level concerns for people on the ground, so to speak, in a disaster area. So that's understandable. But the FEMA website does have resources. And they do point out, by the way, I'll interrupt myself briefly. They do point out that being aware of rumor and misinformation and occasionally disinformation is important. They really don't offer much in the way of useful tools or really good advice, anything really more than find trusted news and information sources. So that's sort of a gap, in my opinion. I have a link to the CERT page, the Community Emergency Response Team. That is a FEMA program. So it's at FEMA.gov as well. You can probably search their site for CERT, but you'll get tons of articles and other silliness. So you can start at the emergency managers / individuals communities / preparedness - activities - webinars / community. Yeah, you get the idea. It's a government website. So this really long URL will get you to the Community Emergency Response Team. If you type CERT, CERT, into your favorite search engine, you will probably find this page. CERT. I am a CERT volunteer, by the way. Post-Katrina reforms, because you may be thinking, oh, but what about Hurricane Katrina in Louisiana? So the FEMA.gov website has one resource about the post-Katrina reforms, the national level, what do they call it? National level exercises. There's a post-Katrina Emergency Response Reform Act that was introduced in 2005, I think it was. It wasn't completely obvious. I was looking at the Senate page on introduced bills, and it did not indicate that it was actually passed, but there are references that it sounds like it did. So the Post-Katrina Emergency Response Reform Act of 2006, I believe it is. You can read about it because in that article, FEMA.gov /emergency-managers /planning-exercises /NLE for national level exercises, was it? I'm forgetting already. To finish that URL, and /NLE/background, and that will tell you some information about, yep, there we go. So national level exercise background. It's just they've made an administrator role that's responsible for these, the post-Katrina emergency management, not response, sorry. Management Reform Act, the PKEMRA of 2006. Oh, okay. I think the Senate Act was Post-Katrina Emergency Response Reform Act, something like that. Anyway, NLEs are really drills, practice. They are preparation for the national scale emergency response, which FEMA is responsible for, and this can go all the way down to localities. So there's a bunch of information here. There are resources. There's an article, I should say. There's a page for the national level exercise of 2024. They practice for cyber attacks and other things. So it's kind of interesting. It's interesting to read these things and be aware of them before you need them, which nobody does. It's unfortunate. And I have a link to the Wikipedia page for Smart City, just for you to peruse. I think a smart city is a headline, as a hype. You can declare yourself to be a smart city, and nobody really knows what that means. So they're like, okay, great. What about traffic? So, but that's the end of the links. So let's get the show started. I think today will be short. I think it'll be a brief show on this Friday. Maybe not. Maybe 45 minutes. We'll see. We're already at 13. I used to ask people, not kidding, I used to ask people to define a smart city. And they would list the usual items like traffic monitoring and air quality, and they would talk about recycling and all kinds of, internet access, wireless, Wi-Fi. There's a lot of monitoring, air quality monitoring, traffic monitoring, people monitoring. So a lot of probably includes cameras in the name of personal security, not privacy, security. Don't confuse those. And so there's a lot of monitoring, a lot of measurement, some communication. So smart city, but it's kind of vague. You can start reading, go down that rabbit hole. After they finish listing their favorite or most familiar items, and these would vary slightly, but most people have the basic, air quality, weather, pollution, air quality. I asked for the missing item, and they would often kind of look at me like, what? And I would say, what about the people? Oh, yeah, of course, the people. Well, that should have been maybe the first or second item. Like the people in the city, they should be aware that you are in a smart city. Hey, people, you're in a smart city. Here's what that means to you. And B, you should account for the people when you're designing and pondering what the smart city is and will be. It's really nice to install a bunch of technology and make a bunch of headlines. But if it's not helpful or useful, or if people don't know about it, then what? So something to think about right there. You can view the Wikipedia page if you want. You can look for various definitions and descriptions online. You'll find many. Your city may consider itself a smart city. I know Las Vegas is very proud to call itself a smart city. I don't know that they know what that means. And I've been, one of the notions that we began rebooted the Innovate for Vegas Foundation was to make our smart city smarter, because it could definitely use some of that. And maybe that applies to where you live as well. So it's safe to say that a smart city leverages modern technologies and innovations to improve the quality of life of at least some of the people who reside in that city. Some of the people? Well, often the features of a smart city can be realized directly by people with access to technology, like a home of some kind, a connection to the internet via wired or wireless services, and devices like phones or tablets or traditional computers, maybe a smart TV or something. Maybe you have a vehicle or at least some mobility and places to go. So you're kind of moving through this smart city with your devices and connectivity, and there's information that is accessible to you that you might need or benefit from. So you're the customer. It may be that people who don't have all these things cannot or do not, or may not even be aware that they have access to these things. resources in a library or other kiosks. So there are presumptions in the smart city model about who the target audience, who the customers are. And is that a good thing or not? It's hard to say. I think a smart city should be aware, if I can anthropomorphize the city, a smart city should be somewhat aware of its people, the people that are in it. Everything, if we're going to do so much monitoring, we should try to keep track of people who need help or people who are left out of these programs, people who are left out of access to information, people who cannot make use of these resources. So that's maybe that's too political. I don't know. Anyway, the some smart cities may develop programs to measure and drive access to these services to improve quality of life for people who may not have these accesses. Some do not. So it is sometimes. Las Vegas is rather famously a city that would provide a bus ticket to people who may not have the other accoutrement to access smart city services. So exactly what to do with the people in the smart city is kind of one of those things that is hand waved a little bit sometimes. It's not an episode about that. That might be a different episode. But bottom line, some people don't have access to these services. But guess what? They may be more prepared than you are. So what if over time, even the most basic of technologies in place, such as telephony services, access to potable water, electricity, transportation, and resources like food and medical care become presumed utilities that we can all depend on all the time. But what happens if they go away? The more a town or city depends on its technology, the more features of their smart city are simply assumed to be available to the people living there on demand. The more impact is likely if those features of their smart city are suddenly unavailable. So the more used to these things we become, the more dependent on them we become. And then when they become unavailable, we are suddenly wandering the streets thinking, how do I function? I don't have the internet. What is TikTok going to do for me now? I'm being witty, but it is a thing. It's a real thing. It's that people depend on, if my electricity went out, and this may be true for you as well. If it goes out for more than a day, it becomes problematic. And I'm not even dependent on electricity for health machine, like any sort of respiration or so help breathing or help with anything. I don't need monitoring. So just the lights on, the computer on. Gotta have those things. If the computer shuts down, I shut down. So if water goes away for more than a day or two, that can become problematic very quickly. So we've all grown used to the modern conveniences, and a smart city espouses these and more that make it smart. So when they go away, suddenly not so smart. So the more you presume these are always available, the more impact is likely when they are not, especially suddenly. Imagine for yourself the last time there was a power outage or internet connection went down, cell phone service was unavailable. And by the way, those kinds of things, if they last for more than an hour, they make the news. A cell phone service being down for more than minutes, that's headlines. AT&T and Verizon, I believe, have both had major national outages that lasted for multiple hours. That's panic mode. That is severely problematic. Power outages, you will always hear how many thousands of customers are experiencing an outage from your local power company. The national power grid is, of course, a national security nightmare. That's another topic for another time, which I don't know. By the way, I'm not an expert in any of these things. The fact that I'm a CERT volunteer and that I've done some interaction in this space means I'm slightly ahead of the normal person on the street. But it's good to be a little bit ahead just because I'm that much closer to knowing what's going on when the lights go out and they don't come back on. So imagine for yourself any of these things, traffic issues. Traffic will really make news sometimes. Here in the greater Vegas area, we are our national bird is the traffic cone. I think it is the bird, or is it the plant? Both. So traffic issues are normal here because of road construction and other such things. But when there's an 18-wheeler, what do they call those nowadays? Transport. Cargo truck was transporting lithium batteries I believe, heading to California. And if it turns over on the freeway and bursts into flames, those flames are staying hot for days. So this incident that occurred blocks traffic going to California, Barstow, right, heading between Nevada, Las Vegas, and LA. Traffic could be snarled up for a while. What happens with food and water to people who are stuck on the freeway for a day or two? Somebody might be prepared for that, but the people in the cars probably aren't. So the traffic is just as much an issue in some cases. If you want to evacuate a city and there are only a few places to go to get out of town, can the roads accommodate everyone leaving at the same time? Things like this. So you never know. The last time your grocery store was out of some essential items, and that of course has happened within the last few years. We can recall some of those. Some of these have happened even in the last months, the phone and the traffic I just mentioned here and surely elsewhere. For some, these are happening today in the last several days as I record this. So dumb city, got to be ready for dumb city. This is not a commentary about the people in the smart city, of course. A dumb city is the opposite of a smart city in that all of or most, but probably all for some part of the time, all of the features of a city that make it a smart city are gone. Temporarily, we might hope, but for some window of time, all of those features we depend on are not available when we get right down to it. And by the way, I mentioned earlier, if my power goes out, oftentimes we are kind of ready and we can deal with hours of one thing going down. All complete total system failure is something most people don't prepare for and are... I don't think the prepper community is a majority of the population. So not having candles or batteries that are charged for flashlights and other such things, that's just the bare minimum, right? To be able to light your hallways so you don't fall down your stairs if you have them. That's like that's about as minimum as it gets. Candles or working flashlights. And do you check those batteries now and then? So, yeah, temporarily we hope. But if those systems are down for more than a day, we start to get a little crazy. Now imagine a week, 2 weeks. I'm seeing in the news, some people on the ground, if they're able to get cell access lately, it could be months before potable water is restored in the normal water distribution system for different places within the affected disaster areas. That is not trivial. Water, does that make a smart city? Well, go without water coming out of your faucets for 2 or 3 days and you'll start to say, what? Have we returned to the Stone Age? But water distribution of potable water, you could argue, is a pretty substantial technology if you look at it in a historical context. So I'm gonna include potable water distribution as part of a feature of a smart city. So when we get right down to it, a smart city, if it is the people plus the infrastructure, a dumb city is the people without the infrastructure. And there's not much else in place otherwise. Not to make light, but it is basically a return to camping. And people in an affected region need to depend on themselves and each other, at least initially, because the smarts in the smart city are gone. They may return eventually over time, but frankly, I'm impressed that some people are able to get back online in these affected areas, and they're mostly taking pictures and sharing stories of the devastation, which are useful because some people outside of the area will want to know, how bad is it? Are my friends and family okay? And so on. And they're not always able to access. So individuals become sources of information at large. With communications on the ground often unavailable, as I was just saying, getting help and support from outside the affected region from local, state, and national services can take some time to coordinate. Unfortunately, you cannot simply start dropping supplies on cities. There's an assessment that has to happen to plan these things. It doesn't take months. It takes days. It takes certainly many hours. So with communications out, it's very difficult. If you're not able to communicate with people on the ground, your first response in the localities, you got to start building up these lines of communication so that support efforts can be coordinated. You don't want to start dropping food and potable water into places where there are no people or where they can't access them. So the best ways to access and the best ways to get to people, and so on. It takes time. This is often disconcerting, made worse because access to information becomes profoundly difficult amidst the chaos. So you may start hearing things, and the rumors can move much more quickly than the facts, and it can even become politicized, which is, of course, ridiculous. And it's probably the George W. Bush 43 legacy, the post-Katrina legislation, hopefully the things that FEMA has learned and different local first response and so on, local, state. Yeah, there were some substantial mistakes there. And so it's easy to believe stories like, oh, they're not helping. So it's unfortunate, but understanding, I don't know if you can hear that. It sounds like either a dirt bike or somebody's leaf blowing. That's annoying. Let me pause and check. All right, I think that was leaf blowing. I think they're gone. So yeah, let's talk about CERT. One thing to ponder in your smart city before calamity strikes is whether where you live includes a group of trained volunteer civilian first responders that are part of a FEMA program called CERT, or Community Emergency Response Team. If you know someone who is a CERT volunteer, and remember I am one, so you probably don't know me, or if you are one yourself, great. You are that much closer to knowing what to do or what is being done in the case of a catastrophic emergency, or what you might hear, which I, for some reason, misspelled. You might hear referred to as a disaster, and it is important to recall, if you're not aware of these things, the terminology that's used: a national emergency, a state emergency, a disaster area, because it is useful for the purposes of communicating situation, nature of situation, use of, declaring an emergency. This is a disaster area. These are clear and terms with specific meanings. When you hear things like FEMA's not providing aid, there's a gate. On one side of the gate, it is FEMA saying, do you need help? On the other side of that gate might be the governor of a state, or it might be the mayor or other sort of local county or city leadership, until they declare an emergency, until they make an official proclamation along those lines. So we're declaring an emergency. Okay, that kicks off a process for funding, for emergency access to funding, for preparation for emergency response. Assessment teams can be deployed. So there's all sorts of things that happen, and then they will refer to an area as a disaster and all that. So there's some of these things you'll pick up in the CERT volunteer process. And again, I'm not an expert in these things. So I'm 3 CERT volunteer sessions over the past couple of years, hours ahead of you on some of this stuff. So CERT, I found some things that are interesting. One big take home. So if you're a CERT volunteer, you attend these volunteer training courses. They're usually 2 days. There's a super simple written test. It's a lot of slide presentations and some practical examples, how to work with a fire extinguisher, how to bandage and splint some basic wounds. I'll give you 2 things. One I did not write down, so I'm calling an audible. But there are 2 take-home lessons. One, when you're a CERT volunteer, they tell you should be prepared for about 4 days of isolation. 4 days, up to 4 days, sometimes a little bit more, but figure 4 days. You should have enough emergency materials, food, water, clothing. By the way, depending on who's giving you training, they may suggest that you have a container, maybe like a trash container, or like on wheels with a lid that's weatherproof. You tape it, you seal it against critters, against all manner of small animals that might be looking to get into your stuff. Raccoons are notorious. So you take one of these refuse containers, sometimes provided by your county or city or whomever, sanitation company. You can fill that with foodstuffs, drinkable water, emergency materials, And they suggest that you always put clothing on top, some shirts, pants, boots, work gloves, and so on. Why put them on top? Well, it's entirely possible that you may need to depart your home with less than full dress. And so they say it's a good idea to keep some clothes on top. If you need to, you can get dressed outside while the world is coming to an end. But so preparation for 4 days. Why 4 days? Well, an emergency is declared, there is an assessment, and if it may not even be an assessment, emergency response, emergency declaration. So there may not be FEMA resources coming. So for a smaller emergency, it may just be local first response, your state, police, fire, EMTs, and so on, or your city or local. So, but depending on what's happening, if they're able to, the people that are responding will make this assessment, and they will determine the worst hit areas, the areas that are suffering the most in this disaster, and they will go there first. So as they tell us in the training, you probably don't want to be in the worst hit area. So you should be prepared to be in the normal areas that are going to be waiting in line, because the worst hit areas get first access to emergency services. That seems to make sense. Although you can hope over time that the tuning of the response will be, say, better. Grouping emergency response geographically does make sense logistically, but there may be different areas that are suffering different ways. This area is not so bad except for that one thing. And Houston was famously flooded many years ago, and they had some storage of dangerous chemicals in the basement or lower levels of a company, of a lab, a research lab of some sort, or whatever it was. So while the area itself was fairly stable, there were floodwaters everywhere. But these storage units, I think they were refrigerated to keep the chemicals from reacting, or I think it was chemical and not biological. So, they're now underwater. They're no longer functioning. And if they begin to leak, now you're leaking these dangerous chemicals into the water. So even though the area itself was not particularly high priority, I think that element elevated the priority for that locality. So I think, I'm recalling from memory, but that's something to be aware of, is how the response is planned, and it may take several days. So it's not, they forgot about us. It's that you're in line. It's a queue system. There's resources and experts and people that know what they're doing, and they will get to you after they've helped people that are in greater need. So that's where CERT comes in, because now you have people trained ahead of time in your communities. There may be a CERT volunteer living next door to you, or in your house, or down the street. That person will have some awareness, and there's training about what to do in the case of an emergency, an activation. There may not be an activation. If there's an earthquake and there's no communication, you can assume that there's a problem. Now, I will tell you there's a gap here that we'll talk about soon in the next section. What do you do? As a CERT volunteer, what do you do when there's no activation but an emergency? But here's the thing. They train the CERT volunteers to begin a search and rescue effort. These are simple. You're not to risk your own life. You're not to take extraordinary risk to attempt to save someone. Don't go into a burning building. Now, of course, that's easy to say, but from a liability standpoint, they cannot advise civilian volunteers to go running into burning buildings. But don't go into precarious situations. Don't go into a building that looks like it's going to fall down. So be sensible, but at the same time, humans are humans. So it's what happens at the time, and that's hard to prepare for. Now, one of the things they teach you in the search and rescue component of the CERT volunteer effort, you must go and find people who are injured, people who are in need of medical assistance. And you do a field triage. You can do it at the time you locate them, or you can do it at the time they are gathered in a something of a holding area, so that when first responders arrive, all of the people in need of medical assistance are in one place, so they can receive treatment on the ground, be transported easily, and so on. So the goal is to transport people to a central location, the command center, the incident response command center, I think it is, incident command center, which they go through the basics of how you set up and start writing things down, taking notes, and so on. So this is a long path to get to, but they teach you about this field triage, and the stark reality is this. If you are planning to be inaccessible by first response, real first response, if I may, 4 days is a long time. So people who are not going to make it, you have to let them go. So if you are not to begin CPR on someone, for example, because of the way CPR works, you cannot stop it until you hand the person off to a first responder or they expire. So you have to, because you are limited in resources and because there is more time to account for than this person may have, you have to triage very aggressively. And so that's a stark reminder. So you may be on your own for several days, and the people that you find and want to help you may not have the resources and expertise. So that's going to happen. So yeah, the critical needs will be addressed first. And that's something that is not always clear. And that's where the rumors and the panic can set in and so on. So you may need to wait. So some entrepreneurial thinking, because this is an audio program about exactly that. There is disaster response infrastructure in place. That's good to know. Hurricane Katrina is perhaps something that comes to mind as an example where infrastructure and process break down. The government conspiracy theories. The fact is there were some very bad behaviors displayed, but the process itself broke down. There was inaccurate information. There was a certain lack of preparedness for the scale and the nature of the failures and how to get into places and where people were congregating in that sports stadium, I think it was. So just a number of things did not work. It was unfortunately a great demonstration of why improvement was essential. Hence the post-Katrina legislation to improve or to require improvement of FEMA infrastructure and process. And you're probably correct, though. The Hurricane Katrina problem was a substantial problem. The question is whether there is a feedback mechanism to assess success and failure in each disaster response. And that's part of the national, what does it stand for again? National learning? Is that what it is? National level. Jeez. National level exercise. So I'll read the objectives. It's 4 things from the NLE 2024. Climate change implications for national security, information sharing, that's a good one, response and stabilization, and intermediate and long-term recovery. So they look at these things, sort of a hackathon. And they're also including cyber attacks in there. So response to cyber attacks, response to, they're looking at supply chain issues when there's damage occurs at ports of entry in different harbors and so on. So that things have changed since Katrina, so that's a good thing. Have they changed sufficiently? Well, that's what we get to find out every time there's a real need to activate these resources. Declaration of an emergency. The question is whether there is the feedback mechanism, like I said. So there is at the national response measurement level, right? When they do these exercises, they can assess them. The problem, in my opinion, from my observations, is that every time there's an outing, even if there's not a FEMA national level response, so the NLE, the national level exercise, is useful for a national level response. But if the response never gets to that level, if it's handled by first response locally, now the CERT volunteers are activated locally. Each area, the city of Las Vegas basically drives the emergency management office in the city of Las Vegas drives the emergency management efforts and training of CERT volunteers. So if we are activated, it will be through the city of Las Vegas, even if the emergency is in a different part of the area. When that happens, there may be some activity. There may be some actual civilian response, volunteers taking action. And I asked during my training, do they ever do like an after action? Do they do a postmortem? Hopefully nobody actually died, but a postmortem or some sort of retrospective to figure out what worked and what didn't for a continuous improvement. And they looked at me like I was speaking some other language, and they were like, nope. Once the first responders get there, the volunteers are essentially done. They're like, okay, you can go home now or do whatever you want. And I thought that was a failure of the imagination. So maybe that's entrepreneurial thinking right there. Learning from every outing is built in for the first response teams and the infrastructure, especially for the post-Katrina Emergency Act and so on. But it's not necessarily built in at the volunteer or local levels. So you may find, like, why is this happening again? And anyone who has seen, every year there's a fire in California and there's a flood in Florida and there's a tornado in Oklahoma and all that. Well, obviously you can't snap your fingers and stop natural disasters. A tornado is a weather phenomenon. It's not really caused by people. Now, is it a climate change thing? Maybe. Tornadoes are caused by different high pressure and low pressure fronts coming into passing each other and causing the tornado. So weather patterns, climate change, okay, but generally speaking, tornadoes they're not something you can mitigate ahead of time. You can't, and same with hurricanes and so on. Fire, you can try to trim the brush away, pull it back from buildings, fire breaks, firewalls, but still, every year we have these similar headlines in the news, and the question is always what can be learned from these incidents at a smaller local level and try to do better next time. And it's not necessarily clear to me, although I have not done a deep dive on this, but it's not clear to me that the tools are in place to capture that feedback, to learn from the people who were there. And often they're there without access to these technologies. Their cell phone may not work. Maybe they can't use it. A lot to say. If you are an entrepreneur, you might see some gaps and ponder what to do about those gaps, as I do. One big gap that remains unaddressed by all indications is how to communicate with people on the ground if cell phone and wired communications are disabled for a period of time. What I have asked very specifically in my CERT trainings and in other communications email, I said, now we receive an email to get activated. Presumably you'll send out a text message otherwise. Yeah. I said, now in a real emergency, in a real disaster, what if those are not available? Oh, you just go find the ham radio operator near you. Right, but you don't give us that information. So where do we find that? Oh, it's online. So it hasn't really been thought through at the volunteer tier. So volunteer space tier, TIER. What about communicating with your volunteers? Oh, yeah, we've kind of just emailed. That's just, go find yourself a ham radio operator. So there's a gap there. And in my experience here in the Greater Vegas area, it hasn't really been thought through that this is a problem or how to solve it. There's notions floating around, but I don't know if there's real action or if that action is viable. The people that I spoke with did not leave me thinking, oh, okay, they got this. I will say right now, I'm intrigued by LoRaWAN and Meshtastic. Meshtastic is a free open source project for creating mesh networks with LoRaWAN and maybe similar devices, bridging and so on. If you are not familiar, there's a radio network. There are reserved spectrum and so on for FirstNet. This was a lesson learned from the 9/11 responses where different agencies with different radios were unable to communicate with each other. So similarly, if you're trained volunteers as a resource on the ground close to the disaster, ready to go, cannot be communicated with, then you may, why bother? So being able to bridge first response communications onto some way of contacting and communicating, even just basic information with people on the ground that are in situ, right? They are there. You may not be there. You may be, okay, what's going on in the up in the northern part of Las Vegas? Contact Dan. Well, we can. His email doesn't work. Oh, that's right. That's right. It's a disaster. We don't have internet. So I think this is a substantial gap, and it's one I proposed a solution for. We've talked about it in the Let's Innovate for Vegas podcast, and they would have to take action. And I even tracked down some documents that CERT, there are concerns about communication with volunteers that are CERT trained, they're actively involved, and they're ready to go. And if you cannot communicate with them other than ham radio, not everyone has a ham radio, and not everyone knows where their local ham radio operator is, and you cannot guarantee that the ham radio will be functional. So having backups would be interesting, and this is one of those learning experiences. And yeah, as it happens, Eli, the computer guy, has been impacted by this. If you don't know Eli, he's interesting. He's an interesting character. I've had this cert radio idea for a while, and maybe I'll hit him up to think about how we could collaborate, because he's in a real situation right now, and he's been posting some comments here and there. They're not even sure when they're going to get water again, for example. So communications are up when they can be. He's able to communicate, but the city at large, I think they're trying to find some satellite communication, Starlink, I guess. But they're finding places that have some sort of internet connectivity to get messaging in and out. Guess what? When you're in a disaster area, it is, and by the way, they do train this, make sure you're okay, make sure your family's okay, then start making sure your neighbors are okay, so you kind of work your way out from yourself, right? Because if you're not okay, then you can't really help anyone else. So you start with yourself, the people in your home, your families, and so on, and then you move further and further away, your next door neighbor, the people down the street, the people in your community, people in your city. So when there is nothing, you have to figure out who can help whom, who needs help, who can help, etc. That's entrepreneurial thinking right there. When you're on the ground and there's nothing, you got to start fixing problems. So if you see some of these gaps and you want to fix them or close them, the access to drinkable water, and maybe some, most important is to know who is missing, who is in need of medical assistance, who can be a part of a recovery effort, because those are the things that can really cause problems. If you're worried about where someone is, you might be spending your time worrying. I had to pause there for a moment I had to turn off my air conditioner, which that's another thing that would be a problem in the summer with power outages in Vegas and the desert areas of the U.S. So if you're worried about where your friends, your family, where your neighbors are, that can be a problem. So communicating those things, not only to find out who, should I be, okay, they're okay. Okay, now I can move on to, less important, less emotional and troubling matters, right? So once you know the people that you care about are okay, or that your neighbors and friends, and we'll put care in quotes. At some point, you're going to be concerned about people you barely know. That tends to happen in a disaster area. But once you can figure out who's okay and who you can help and who you cannot, you can move on to the business of getting situated to be ready for a 4-day camping trip. And I only laugh because that is what you have to do. You have to be ready for several days of roughing it. And, that comes down to how prepared you were ahead of time. You may be the most ready, the most well-informed person in a group of hundreds of people. You may be a CERT volunteer. You may be otherwise prepared. Maybe you have some military experience, or maybe you've done search and rescue, or maybe you've done, maybe you're a Boy Scout or a Girl Scout, scouts nowadays. So if you have that level of insight, at least that, then you're probably a little bit ahead of most of the people who may be panicking, who maybe they're confused. And again, maybe they're worried about who and where, and I'm missing my kids were at school, and so the sooner you can figure out who is okay and where they are and communicate that information locally, and then all that information needs to be eventually communicated to first response and so on for medical, etc. So that's part of a recovery effort, is trying to search and rescue, and then recovery is figuring out who is where and how much help they need. Some of these are part of the CERT training, but some ideas that might come from the CERT training are also viable entrepreneurial opportunities. And again, the communication with the CERT volunteers is sort of left to chance. Government entities do not always think like entrepreneurs, but the two together can lead to development of better solutions to real problems that people, today as I record this, unfortunately, experience. I mean, there are people experiencing these things, experience without much in the way of familiarity with what they can expect and when. And so if you don't understand how FEMA assessment of a disaster area, how declaration of emergency, and how that begins a process that is planned, there is an actual There's an actual plan in place. There is movement of materials and so on. Going in and rescuing two people from a boat floating in a flooded area is one thing. Going in and servicing a town of 10,000 to 50,000 people, that is not something you do quite as quickly as grabbing those two people or picking a dog and its owner off the roof of a house that's submerged, right? So if you're thinking, oh, we can just go rescue, well, you can't rescue everybody. So there are plans in places to execute recovery. Disaster aid deployment at scale, and those things take more than 10 minutes. So that's something that people have to be aware of. And the more preparation and training you have ahead of time, the more you will be aware of what the processes are and how long they take and so on. Government entities do not always think like entrepreneurs. I know that's a surprise, but the two together can lead to development of better solutions. Don't forget that. Today, as I record this, as I said, they don't know, the people in North Carolina and Florida, they don't necessarily know. They're not necessarily familiar, even though Florida has hurricanes a lot. Some areas of North Carolina were not prepared for this because they don't get these storms. So if you have ideas, the bridge between you and the government can be a tenuous one. I have reached out to FEMA. The way FEMA functions, so they tell me, is you begin locally with your local FEMA area, FEMA offices, FEMA representatives. You can start with your local emergency management office. The EMO in Las Vegas is problematic. Just like a lot of things in Vegas, they don't necessarily think in modern times. So it will require some effort, and it depends on how entrepreneurial you actually are. So before the next one, a lot of FEMA resource information is available online, which means it is not available when communications are down. Something as simple as publishing an authoritative FEMA resource to be made available offline, right? Like a PDF or an ebook or however you can share it on a phone, probably at the last minute during a storm warning and a potential evacuation window. So at least people would have that information. Being able to read it on your phone, that means charging your phone, would be essential. But at least you'd have the information, even if the cell towers or however you're accessing the internet, even if that's not available for some amount of time, if you're able to charge your phone, maybe you're on the road evacuating a city, you can at least go through a checklist, so these things should be available offline. The presumption that the world is always online is problematic. Unlike our days in school when we were younger, there are few opportunities for fire drills or similar. How often are you reminded, almost like a pre-pushback emergency briefing from your flight attendant? So pushback, when you push back from the gate. I don't know if you've ever noticed this. They have to give you that the emergency training before you push back. So sometimes they kind of let it slide a little bit, but I've been on some Southwest flights where, anyway, avoid Southwest Airlines like the plague. So a pre-pushback emergency briefing from your flight attendant crew on a commercial aircraft. They at least tell you, here's where that is, here's overhead, the mask will fall down, you put it on yourself first. Why do you put it on yourself first? Because you can't help anyone if you are passed out. So you put it on yourself, then put it on your kids, right? So this is not always obvious, even when they're describing it to you. But hopefully you've heard it enough times that you believe at the time you need to, you'll say, oh, I should put this on me first, right? The difference is whether you can function. Useful consciousness, important. So if you get that briefing ahead of time, then you at least have some idea of what to do, where's the inflatable life preserver-ish thing, where are the exits, etc. What do you do in case of various emergencies, right? What do you do? Where do you go when potable water is unavailable for days or months? If power is out for days or longer, if your local hospital is shut down for days, if you are in need of special assistance, if a friend, family member, neighbor, or someone you barely know requires emergency access to power for life support systems of some sort. Maybe they have an electric wheelchair as well. Maybe medicines like insulin, maybe what if they need help and you just don't know where to go, what to do? That person will hopefully be able to tell you some idea because maybe they're prepared, but they just need your help. Without emergency response drills at community or city scale, it is difficult to know what will happen when reality strikes, and then you find out. All manner of rumor, misinformation, and when there is a lack of access to credible and authoritative updates, and of course, disinformation I said that incorrectly. There is all manner of rumor, misinformation, and sometimes disinformation when there's an election coming up. And it's because there's a vacuum of a communication vacuum. There's a lack of credible and authoritative update. Chaos can ensue because people hear the wrong thing. They panic. Panic information can spread very easily. It makes people feel better to get an answer, even if it's not the correct answer. Why is it taking so long? They're not going to come and help us. Well, they are. They're just going to come after they've helped people that are in a worse condition than you are. Most likely. If you are entrepreneurial at all in your work and projects or in your way of thinking, I would suggest that you try out CERT training just to get some idea of what's available and what might be needed in your neighborhood, in your communities, in your city. See what comes of it. Here's a little hint for you. Some people, if you go to the Switch, which is it's a server center. It's a data center for servers. It's fairly substantial. Part of their pitch is that, they've located these in a very safe area because Southern Nevada doesn't have earthquakes and all this stuff. Southern Nevada has more active faults than some parts of California. So there is seismic activity in Nevada, Southern Nevada in particular. To believe that there's just none, that we're all just sitting on a big slab of bedrock, would be a mistake. So if you don't know these things, or you may be surprised to learn these things, we talk about all these things. During my last full CERT training, which was 4 years ago, one of the things they mentioned is that the city of Las Vegas, with the number of people, the greater Vegas area, the number of people traveling to and leaving Vegas, right? 40 million, give or take, is the generally accepted number, and it does bear out based on last year and run rate this year. So about 40 million people are passing through Vegas each year for tourism, entertainment, gaming, conventions, professional sports, right? The fun economy. So one of the focal areas of the Emergency Management Office and of the local, FEMA folks is the potential for a substantial outbreak of disease. And what are the chances that that's going to happen? So now I'm not going to start a conspiracy theory here, but if you do look from 2020, we did have CES in January of 2020, and then the first outbreak in Seattle was 2 weeks later. The first detected case, the first case of SARS-CoV-2 and what would eventually be called COVID it was called that in 2019, COVID-19, but they identified this as a case of COVID, SARS-CoV-2 infection. And there were big outbreaks in New York and San Francisco and Chicago. And if you look at the point of origin of most domestic tourism of Las Vegas, it is Seattle, Los Angeles, San Francisco, Chicago, New York. Coincidence? Who knows? But the fact is, outbreaks of disease are one of the Emergency Management Office's concerns for Vegas. So knowing where you live, what challenges might be faced, how much preparedness there is, and what role you can play could be a part of your entrepreneurial considerations. Maybe there are some gaps that you can close. Then you can see what people around you would do with your innovation, and you can go from there. So that's where I'm going to leave it. I hope wherever you are, that you are prepared in some way for what might unfold. And if you are presently dealing with hurricane and or tropical storm Helene, is it Helena? Helene. Let me check. Helene. Hopefully you are recovering. I understand that there are more than 200 people that did not make it through. That is unfortunate, of course. There's nothing that can be done. We have to hope for the best for the people that do make it, and hopefully there will be learning experiences aplenty, and we'll see what comes of it until the next time. But in our case, until the next time for next week's episode, the next week, the 8, 9, and 10 of October, there is the Mobile World Congress here in Greater Vegas, in the Las Vegas Convention Center, actually. So I will still be publishing a show on Friday, an episode. Don't know what it will be about, but maybe it will be something related to what I see at the Mobile World Congress Las Vegas 2024 extravaganza. In the meantime, don't forget to check out buymeacoffee.com/DanHugo, ko-fi.com, ko-fi.com/DanHugo. You do not have to spend any money, but you can keep up with the various things. And do check out your local CERT volunteer resources and consider participating yourself. I have found it to be quite interesting. I've learned a lot in the main training and the refreshers, just to have some more insight about the way things work, and the fact that they do, with exceptions and occasional substantial and profound learning experiences, they mostly do work. They just don't work very quickly, and that's something to be aware of. That is where I will leave it for today. Thank you for listening as always. And I did go over. I hit an hour and 5 minutes by the clock. We'll see if I truncate some pauses, how close to 45. It'll probably be 55 minutes, but that's where I'll leave it. Thank you for listening as always. Until next time.